Exhibitors and staff in now. Media after the crowd
through the fences.
Please have your badges and show distance.
That sounds like a good plan. Quarter crabs there somewhere.
We couldn't find quarter crabs around.
Now we going to some religion. That sounds like a good plan. Quarter crabs there somewhere.
We couldn't find quarter crabs around.
Now we going to some religion. That sounds like a good plan. Oh, really? Robert, where's the shot?
Right now, the net may be the buzzword in the 90s, but huge success with Amazon and eBay.
What I'd like to do is go over briefly a little bit of the early history of Vectrex, tell you a few of the high points. Many of you may know them even better than I from reading about it. Then introduce some of the team members that can tell a little bit about their part in the Vectrex. Part of our staff on one winter day went out cruising the Army surplus stores, as they were wont to do at lunchtime. And in my memory, and certainly reinforced by some of the things been written, it was John Ross and Mike Purvis came back holding an item that was about the size of this water bottle. It was 1 inch in diameter and about 6 inches long, and it was a CRT, a little cathode ray tube. I believe it was used in military instrumentation. They came back proudly holding this, said, "Great idea for a new game." And as it turned out, from that seed grew the Vectrex. July or August of 1981, and we went to a fellow by the name of Ed Krakauer, who was the key guy for Intellivision at Mattel. He had left Mattel, formed his own company, which ended up being called GCE, General Consumer Electronics. Ed was really quite a visionary, and he took a look at that and said, "That's great, wonderful. If it can have a bigger screen, I'm really interested." And so by September, October, we were in full swing with a plan to do the game system and 12 games, to have them all ready and showable by June of 1982. That's about 9 or 10 months away. So in the ensuing 10 months, we developed the entire game system, the operating system for the game, 12 games that were showable at CES, and that was the birth of Vectrex.
I'd like to tell you a little bit about the design process behind the creation of the game Spike. One day, and he said, "You know, we're doing this Vectrex system, and we're just drawing vectors, and so games don't have to be flat and two-dimensional. I want something that looks 3D. We didn't have the 3D glasses yet. He said, "I want something that looks 3D. See if you can come up with something that'll do that." So I was a big fan of Donkey Kong, and so I decided, let's start with something kind of like Donkey Kong. Let's have some platforms, but instead of them just kind of sitting there like that, let's have them angled and tilted, and you're looking at it from over here instead of... So that's what I did. For my little hero in the game, my star, I had to have something that didn't use too many vectors, because the Vectrex had limitations. You couldn't draw too many vectors at a time on a screen, otherwise you'd get a lot of flicker. So I wanted to draw a little character who didn't use too many of those, and you couldn't draw a circle for the head because a circle would have to take a lot of little short vectors, and you didn't want to draw somebody whose head was shaped like a square or a triangle, so I needed a star for my game, and so I decided to draw his head with this in the shape of a star. Put little legs on him and off we go. Now he needs a name. So I went around the shop and I talked to different people. Jay, you probably remember Colin down in the model shop. I was talking to him about it and he said, oh well, you know, my father-in-law's name is Spike. I think that'd be a good name because he's kind of spiky. Look at him, you know. So I thought Spike was a pretty good name for it.
Popular Vectrex games that had sort of product stuff built into them, like Mindstorm and Scramble. And we developed a whole line of toys, action figures, much like you see from Todd McFarlane and a few of the other Tomb Raider things. But we had not just regular toys. Some of these toys actually used the Vectrex. They actually, I remember in Scramble you were flying over the big walls on that station and gun cannons and things up on pods and things like that. We actually built that. That slipped over the Vectrex. The screen was part of the play pattern, so you're flying your ship, and the analog controller snapped underneath the ship, and as you move stuff on the ship, it moved the analog controller and kicked the buttons around. So we said, hey, what do you think about this? You know, it only costs us $9 to make, and you can sell it for $50. Nah. You know. And internally, we love this thing. Come back with the way to blow this thing up, be competitive, and keep us in this business. So, we started on several campaigns. One was, how do we take the basic technology and start to expand it? Now, Jay was working on color and a couple other things, and that we kind of left that to him. And we looked at the peripherals, and we started making some of the same mistakes the other guys were doing. So we had developed a full QWERTY keyboard, and we had overlays for that. So, you know, you could use it as sort of a weird, strange word processor, and a musical device, playing really bad music with speaker systems that sort of plugged into it in odd places.
In writing a game pitch, and that was my specialty, working for Jay, was writing pitches that he would go out and sell to people, is the lead. Now, the most difficult sentence to write in any game pitch is the lead. Now, whenever possible, you construct the lead with a sentence that begins, the object of the, insert your own game name here, object of this game is to, and then you fill in the blanks, and then you got your lead. And secret number 2, every game tells a story. And then you tell the story of what happens in your game. And secret number 3 is the close. Now that's the most difficult part of the game pitch after the opening. And a good way to construct a close would be a sentence such as, the action in insert your game name here ends when the player has exhausted his game's life.
You can also see a color Vectrex. Unfortunately, it doesn't operate, but it was a serious proposal put in a regular Vectrex case, and it was the TV tube had 2 layers of phosphor. The obvious thing to do is make it into a color TV, but it was 3 times as expensive because instead of 1 gun for black and white, you had to have 3 guns for RGB. You had to have the mask on the tube. The tube was more expensive. The electronics were more expensive. It was out of the question, cost-wise. This was a black and white Vectrex that had 2 layers of phosphor on the tube, a red layer and a green layer. And you ran the electron gun into the CRT at 2 different voltages, 18,000 volts and 25,000 volts. At 18,000 volts, you got a red image. At 25,000, you got a green image. 22,000, you got an orangish image. And at 30,000, you burned a hole in the tube. And so if you go and look at the color Vectrex in the museum, it has a nice little hole burned in the phosphor in the middle.
I use the spinner right here, and there's my fire.
Hey folks, over in the corner here, in the back,
It's the best. I mean, you're not going to find anything like this out there.
If you're sick of all
Really, I spent most of my hobby time as a youth playing Atari 2600 games, and I think that's why all of you are also here today. They have plenty of things to talk about, so I'm going to get right into it. On the very far left is, I'm sure you all know, Rob Fulop, Howard Scott Warshaw, Bob Smith, Steve Woita, and Bob Polaro. Without further ado, please welcome the legendary Atari 2600 programmers.
Working there, it was a very special moment in time and space. I mean, you got to take yourself back to the with the early '80s, late '70s. If you're a computer programmer, your basic jobs were the military and Atari. And there wasn't a lot of there was no software. There was no Bill Gates wasn't doing this thing, and there was no personal computer business. Or there was the Atari 400, 800, which was like the big new thing that Atari was just bringing out. It cost I think $1,000 or $1,500. And I remember the feeling of buying one with my. There was a deal you could get some money taken out of your paycheck to get your Atari computer, and I was so excited to have my Atari computer. Being able to do BASIC for my home was so exciting. It was exciting. You could do graphics, but what was really true is that because the options in the world were military work or Atari, we really had a ragamuffin crew of people. I mean, people that came in, carpenters and painters, people that were craftsmen into software came to Atari. And I think that was the key thing about all the people on this right up here, the people that were really into video games. They were all craftsmen. They were the people that would be good model makers when they were younger, or people were really into to really making something just right. Spend the extra hour or 2 hours or 2 weeks to just polish something to death.
It was an interesting thing that happened when I was doing Yar's Revenge, which wasn't originally called Yar's Revenge. Originally there was any one of a number of fairly lame titles I thought for the product, and I didn't want it to go that way. So I started to think of how am I going to deal with marketing to get a name that I prefer for the cartridge. So I wrote a story that was the backstory for Yar's Revenge, and I submitted that to marketing with the title Yar's Revenge. And they said, okay, they'll put on the list, and they'll just talk about it, and they sort of said to me, you're an engineer, so we'll get back to you. And I thought I needed to do a little marketing of my own. So what I did was, there was a friend of mine in marketing. I called him over, I told him I wanted to tell him a little secret. And I had to make sure that this was going to get out and around marketing, so I swore him to secrecy. And when he agreed, I told him, well, Yar in Yar's Revenge is actually Ray, spelled backwards. And that's for Ray Kazar, who was the CEO of Atari at the time. And he goes, oh, I go, yeah. And Razak, the solar system, that the game takes place in, that's Kazar spelled backwards, so there's no ambiguity. And he goes, does Ray know about this? I said, oh yeah. You don't think I'd do this without Ray knowing? I said, you can't tell anyone. This is top secret. And he swore he wouldn't tell anyone, so I knew this was out. And like 3 days later, he calls me and says, guess what? He goes, we're going with Yar's Revenge. He goes, they picked Yar's Revenge after all. He didn't tell anybody. Oh no. And then a few months later, we were at a press conference and they had some games playing around. They had Yar's up and Ray Kazar was there. And Ray comes up to me and goes, hey Howard. And I go, yes, Ray. And he goes, I heard about that little Yar's thing. And I told him, I said, oh. Is that okay with you, Ray? He goes, very cute, huh? Make another game.
That's probably the best one I can think of. The other minor one that happened a couple of times was people sneaking into labs and changing code. There were two great incidents of this. One was with the soccer game. A man by the name of Steve Wright, who had done the soccer game, was working with Mike Lorenzen, who had done quite a few more 2600 cartridges. So Mike snuck in early one morning and changed all the graphics for the players, from an overhead view to kind of a realistic, here's the legs. Steve came in and absolutely freaked out. And of course, 6 months later, everybody recognized that that was the correct style to do the game in. But that was a good one, but only to watch Steve go ballistic. The other good one was while Todd was working on 400, 800 asteroids, we snuck in and put happy faces in place of the asteroids. So now instead of shooting asteroids, you got to shoot happy faces, and you generate smaller happy faces and smaller happy faces. It felt really good. I think Todd ran out of ROM, so it didn't make us an Easter egg. But that was another high point.
On Taz, which I wanted to, I wasn't sure what to call the game because Tasmania Devil seemed too long, and so I'm looking at it and going, okay, I'll try TAZZ and see what that looks like on the 6-character kernel on the title screen. Because I figure if you put it on there and then you show marketing, you have a better chance of getting whatever name you've got on there. And it seemed to be the case. And Warner came down and said, well, we like the name, but just pull one of the Z's off, so it'll only be TAZ. And so we had to go through another, what was it, 200 hours of test or something? I don't know, just because I changed that. And so we did it, and it kind of stuck. I think for a while, the Tasmanian Devil was kind of dormant for like 5 years or whatever, and then all of a sudden I started seeing TAZ on stuff, and I was like, I wonder if the game had anything to do with it, I don't know. So I'm still wondering myself, but everybody laugh now? Okay.
All right, Bob. My first product at Atari was Handheld Breakout, which was a 32-bit, never shipped. It was a 32 by 32-bit LCD screen with a 4-bit single-chip computer with like 32 nibbles of RAM and a kilobyte of ROM, which was actually even a tighter box than the 2600 is. And then I did Asteroids on the 400, 800, and I kind of slacked off on that. So Dennis gave me a really lousy, actually a technical term, it's a really shitty review in 1981, and told me that basically I wasn't cutting the mustard and I should leave. And then he asked me to do Pac-Man on the 2600. Well, at the time, really no one knew. I mean, no one knew Pac-Man was not big in May of 71. May of 81 was not good. And then after that, I ran the Sword Quest series, did Xevious, and then I stopped working on games and started doing component screen drivers for other games, basically, for a couple of years.
But there was a story I wanted to help Todd with a memory, because there was a story from that Monterey brainstorming session that to me illustrates some of what Rob was talking about with Steve Wright and what Todd was talking about things he doesn't remember. And it was, but this was a great story. There was after that dinner, there was a great deal of intoxication. We all went up to a hotel room on the 4th floor or so to engage in other sorts of intoxicants. And Steve Wright, who was a director at that point, was with us at the time. We were all up in this room, and Todd was there, and I was there, and quite a few of us were there, and we were sort of, having a good time. And at one point, we look over at the balcony, and Todd is standing up on the balcony, on the railing. And this is like on the 4th floor. We know we took the elevator up, and we're thinking, holy shit. What are you doing, Todd? And Todd goes, I'm thinking of jumping. I think I can make this jump. We're all pretty wasted, we're thinking, yeah, Todd, have another toke, please. And he goes, no, I think I can make this jump. And he jumps. And he jumps around the room, and we are like stunned. We're like, holy shit. And Steve Wright's like, oh my God, what if they find out I'm here? And we go running up, we're stumbling or whatever, to the rail, and we look over. And there is Todd, who's just standing there looking up like this, because there was like a little garden plateau, because the hotel's built on a very steep hill. And so from the front, where it was 4 floors up, in the back there was like this little patio right below the hill. Todd had played us off nicely. And so we're all like, phew. And so you think that's the story. And Steve Wright is like the most relieved at all, because he already saw the headlines that were going to be removing him from his position. And that was the worst that what could have happened had Todd having jumped off the balcony. That was the worst outcome.
We played a lot of volleyball at that time during lunch, which was great because we had a volleyball court right next to the building. had a big patio where we'd have a beer bus every Friday afternoon. And that was kind of made it right for us. And
seems to me we can see you here.
yeah, oh, that.
It's good volleyball with drinking.
The story behind that is that I was working on real sports volleyball at the time, and every Wednesday I'd go down to Capitola with Jim Heather and we'd play doubles volleyball and watch the girls play volleyball, and I'd get some ideas on how to. But that'd be after a couple of screwdrivers, and I'd kind of forget it within that.
Anyway, I brought a tape called The Day at Atari. This tape, unfortunately, was made by the coin-op group, which we didn't like the coin-op group. And they didn't like the consumer group because obviously they made these original games and we copied them and made more money. At the end of the day, there wasn't a happy feeling between the consumer and the coin-op. And we don't talk to those guys, and they don't talk to us. I was unusual because I had actually worked in coin-op, and so I knew some of the people there, which is why I have a copy of this tape. This was shot by Owen Rubin and Ed Logg, and I'm going to run it right now. I don't think it's ever been shown in public, and we don't have, I don't have the rights to the tape, so I can't be distributing copies until I go get, But I'll just play it so you can get, and this will really give you a sense of what it was like to work there. These are the guys. And this was shot 1980, I think, 1981. It's shot on film transfer the video years ago, so it's not, it's not a Steven Spielberg production, but you'll get it. So here. This is the first time it's ever been shown publicly. I think. Is it too loud? High-strung because Ray Kassar said publicly that they were high-strung prima donnas. People weren't Atari.
You've even seen them on TV. Perhaps you've read about them in newspapers and magazines. The Atari video games. Well, here in the Atari video game room, where some of the better games have made it, and we're going to show you just how they're made and how it's done. And here is where it all takes place. The Atari Engineering Building. Its bucolic surroundings and picturesque Sunnyvale, staffed by technical people who are truly outstanding in their field. This is how we put out games.
There's no Friday parties.
Atari's great game ideas come from brainstorming sessions such as this. But sometimes we need bigger ideas. Nice going. Successful, but we know what to do with those.
What's that?
Some games, though, will always earn a few quarters. Focus groups are important in improving game quality, as are player interviews.
If you had another quarter, would you play this game again?
No.
Well, what is there about this game you do not like?
Well, for one thing, marketing then uses all all this data with the latest analytical methods to carefully compute production quantities.
We didn't have a whole lot of respect for marketing. There wasn't a whole lot of...
Our modern production facility incorporates the latest in automation technology.
I would say it's fair to say that the coin op and the consumer beers are the exact same culture, which is a bunch of goof-offs. Basically, that was, you know. Huh?
So it's still going on. There's lots of interest in playing ancient games, and there's lots of activity amongst the hobbyists to replicate the old machines and make it possible to design new games for them.
But do you feel comfortable with that? Do you feel comfortable with that as the original?
Well, I have no problem with it. I don't think there are any legal problems involved. The machines have been made for years. Nobody. If Magnavox were desirous of making additional cartridges for old games, they should have done so. Yeah. So let somebody else do it.
Mr. Lawson, do you have any views on the emulator issue?
That can be a double-edged sword. What I see as I by no means can stop the human psyche going on and creating things. I don't think any of us try to do it or want to do it. Some of our legalists will try to legislate our brains and say, you can't do that. I'm not in favor of that. However, I don't want to see it as an industry that will hurt the original people. If it's done as your own toy, your own investigation, and you learn and go on from that point, I think that's a wonderful thing. But if you turn around and crank them out the back door as a new industry, that's not a wonderful thing. So again, like it is, it's like saying to me when people think that patents lock out everybody. Patents are public disclosures on how to do something. In fact, they open the door for you to look at and improve. So my feeling is, well, it depends on who does it and how extensive it is.
And Mr. Smith, correct me if I'm wrong, but he's done an incredible service to the gaming community. You did authorize the distribution of all the original Vectrex ROMs?
I did.
You did, didn't you? Yes.
I have the fortunate position, I guess, of I hold the rights to the Vectrex, having gotten them back, and so it is mine to give, and I am very happy to give that permission to the Vectrex community to duplicate, make, improve, and support that Vectrex. I would certainly, I suppose, if anybody's ever going to go into the large-scale manufacturing of the unit again, I'd like to talk to you. But given what I think is the future of the unit, you have my support, encouragement, and enthusiasm for making it better, faster, cheaper, and more exciting.
Maybe they'll do it in color.
And in color and in 3D. And,
So on to Joe. How do you feel about the Stella emulator and the wealth of ROMs that are available for it on the internet?
I would love to get my hands on this. I would love to get my hands on this emulator. I've spent most of my professional career working about communications, like there's a lot of home networking stuff in Windows that I have something to do with. So I don't live in game space, my children do. I brought an example here. But I'm thrilled that people are able to do this. In fact, I feel like, you know, shadows lift. I have some Stella programming documentation that I can probably publish with impunity now because there's probably no intellectual property issue left. And I know I have 5 patents on the 400, 800 system, and they're probably mostly expired by now. It's possible that that information can be published too. And that would be good.
Well, I'm what you would call an enthusiastic supporter of the emulator movement. I went and took what's called the nutting manual, which is the description of how the Bally Arcade works inside its software listing and its hardware schematics and stuff. And I gave them to somebody, and they're scanned, they're on the internet. Dave, I believe, has forgiven me. The other thing I did is I also went through and looked at some of my old contracts I had, and there's a coin-op game I wrote called Robbie Roto. And Robbie Roto was a smashing failure when it was released as a game. It sort of was Pac-Man plus Dig Dug plus a couple of other things thrown together. But what I decided to do was to just basically permit that to be distributed in MAME emulators without any restrictions at all. So if I can somehow break loose any of the other old coin ops I did from whatever kind of weird mimetic hell they're in, I'd love to do the same.
The question I have for everyone is, what games or experiences outside of your own influenced your work? Was there something that came before your work that you took ideas from? You said, I like the way this worked.
For me, video games, unlike traditional animation, which I thought I was going to go into, video games allowed me to create worlds of entertainment, albeit, especially in the old days, small worlds, but it let you create your own world, your own story. So in terms of influence, it's film, it's cartoon, it's Saturday morning, it's fun. Favorite games, I mean, the first game I went out and bought on my own when after, they were paying me real money for doing, work and get a 9-to-5 paycheck and all that, I went out and bought myself a Battlezone. I just thought that was just blew me away, especially because we couldn't do anything like that at Valley. We had no vector system. But the influences to the games I made were probably, if I had to narrow it down, Saturday morning cartoons, Bugs Bunny, surprise, entertainment, fast, fun, one right after another. Even if something bad's happening, you're laughing at it.
Cartoon influence, I loved the Roadrunner as a kid, and I just had to do a game, so one year I actually did a Roadrunner game for the video disc, and I met Chuck Jones, and I managed to get in fact, I looked at all of his cartoons and cut out footage and put it on a Laserdisc. So if you have one of the very rare Laserdiscs from Roadrunner, it's really worth it. Gauntlet came from D&D. That was getting very heavy around 19 83, 84, and my son was really heavy into that. And I started looking at it, I said, well, this is nice, and I seen a few other games along those lines online. I thought it was really entertaining and educational, and I said, well, you know, I could do something, but I'm more action-oriented, so fine, I can do D&D style characters. So that's where that game came from.
But I'd say probably most influential on me was, well, when I was a kid, the pinball machines were just the absolute ultimate. And I spent many hours in bowling alleys. When I was 8 or 9, I tried to construct a pinball machine out of pieces of plywood and a marble, and I could never figure out how to get the scoring to work. But between pinball machines and board games, which I also played a large number as a child, I'd say that had the biggest influence on me. After I had gotten Super Off-Road out, and it was a really big success, it was coming out right at the same time that Atari got Hard Driving out, which was a true 3D, the first 3D racing game I remember. And I really loved playing that game. Although the first time I played it, it was in a sit-down cabinet that kind of sucks you in and locks. And the reaction of the game was so real that when you would spin out, you would truly spin out. And I was so used to games being forgiving that what you want to do is drive. And when it wouldn't do that, it got me so frustrated. And I would get into games so much that I wanted to get out of it, but it was locked. And I would push back so much until I literally broke the mechanism. This is right with Ron Moore standing there. And, you know, it's like, this is really an intense game. So I got back in and played it and figured out how it really controlled and loved it. And then they came out with Raised Driving with a stunt track. And I just love that. To this day, there's no game I like playing more than that. I could play that forever. I just love that. To me, it's like reality. You just go into the game and you're there.
Okay, real golly. The only thing I found very inspirational, and frankly, I think anybody who's doing work on with the main emulators, writing their own games today, I think that is a terrific thing to be doing. But what made me think of it was that one of the reasons why I enjoyed doing coin-op and why I stopped enjoying doing coin-op was that, and I remember saying this at the time, is that you can walk up to a video game, you can turn it on, and absolutely anything can come up on the screen. It's a tabula rasa. I mean, obviously there are technical limitations, but it doesn't have to be a driver, it doesn't have to be a shooter, it doesn't have to follow any other conventions. I mean, at that time, you know, we were literally inventing what video games were. And it was great. So basically, every game I did, it was just an idea. The idea was to come up with an idea that I hadn't had before, nobody else had had before.
Well, let's see, I remember very clearly playing arcade games back when I was in college, and I was just blown away by them. They were brand new. I remember Pong was actually the first one that got to my college, and as ridiculously simple as it was, having never had any kind of experience like that, interacting with a TV. Oh my God. It was very inspiring to me, and I thought it was very cool. All the early games, Tank, I love Tank. I could play Tank for hours. As they got a little more graphically interesting, Space Invaders was another one, and then things like Pac-Man. I played a lot of Pac-Man. Scramble, which is out there, was one of my favorite games, and I do remember that the biggest.
I think it might be interesting to hear, out of all of the projects that you've either developed or shepherded, which were the greatest failures? Because that's something that... Dave, do you have any comments along those lines?
Oh yeah, after doing about 35 games for Bally, I thought I'd get back and do a quiz game. And the original IQ computer was based on prior knowledge. It would ask you a question about something you already knew. So I thought, I'm going to do a quiz game based on what you see on the screen, the experience that you would have put before you. So I did this great graphic game called Professor Pac-Man. And on the screen I display beautiful, bright, like a sequence of a police chasing a robber through a labyrinth of a street, and then come back and ask, well, how many left-hand turns will the police car take? And I thought it was a really cute, super game. We built 12, and that was it.
You know what?
You didn't have any failures in your whole career?
Well, I don't think in terms of failures. I think in terms of just
learning experiences.
Exactly. But I remember that when I was at Telesis, at that particular time, I learned from Activision that what you really wanted to do is you wanted to get the biggest amount of market share as quickly as you could, because eventually what was going to happen was that the game industry was going to filter out. It was going to go through some kind of a genesis. At that particular point, only the strong were going to survive. And so when I happened to be at Telesis and I saw that a number of the gaming companies like Magic wasn't having any hits and so forth and so on, and Apollo went out, and you saw this was happening, what I decided to do is I said, now the thing to do is, rather than invest a lot of money in tooling for making all of these games and things like that, go around all these companies that are going bankrupt and for pennies on the dollar buy this tooling so that when we're ready to put out more games, we'll have all of this stuff. So it's the same thing, you spend all this money on stuff and then you find that it wasn't going to be as useful as you thought it was going to be.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, I think everybody who's into the classical gaming knows the Amiga computer. But prior to the Amiga computer, the company actually got started by developing a line of joysticks and other controllers. The first of which was very small, could actually play the game with one hand, play it one hand, and it was a really neat product. Sold a slew of them. But we also had this controller you stood on called the Joyboard. Yeah. And boy, I'll tell you, we fell in love with that concept like you cannot believe. And we went out and man, we tested. Why test it? This is great. We're going to make the skiing game, and this is going to be a blast. And we went out and actually did some research on it. The research came back, and we said, do some more research. Some of the research came back, and the research was, screw the research. This is a good product. So what we need is promotion. So we hired Susie Chaffee to go around and do PR for us. I got to tell you something. She was supposed to be a ding-a-ling, but she worked her you-know-what off for us for almost nothing. And she got us on all of the TV shows. And we launched the 408 version, 400-800 version at Studio 54. And I wish we only had made 12. I don't know how many thousands we made and how many thousands of cartridges. We had granules. We had 4 cartridges finished and ready to go when we launched this for the 2600. I would swear to God, if any of you have ever seen one, if you ever see one, let me give you a card because I want to buy one because I don't even have it. We did a surfing game. I can't remember even anymore. We did an Olympic type of thing. Remember the decathlon from Activision? We wore out a CX40 controller from Atari, playing the game once. We go, we're going to run on this thing. Oh, and after that, there are some that are even worse.
We developed Halcyon close to 15 years ago, and Halcyon 15 years ago could do what the games are doing today, but we were ahead of our time. It was a game basically, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, that you could talk to it, just like it was inspired by 2001. It was our Hal, only it was real. You could talk to him, he could talk to you, he would call you by name, he had artificial intelligence, you could control the entire game by speech. And we're now seeing that today, but when we developed Halcyon in '85, we were ahead of our time and we paid the price, and that was we just lost our shirts financially. We spent millions and lost them.
Just real quickly, the way they named Blue Sky Rangers came about for that band, like I say, we were actually technically application software at Mattel, developing Intellivision games and the M Network games for Atari 2600 and later ColecoVision and IBM PC and Apple II and PC Junior. Little various. Yes. But TV Guide wanted to do an article about us. And so came out, did a nice little puff piece on us. They wanted a name. The writer wanted some sort of a hook, some sort of a name to give us. And so he wanted to say that we call ourselves the Blue Sky Rangers because we did use the term Blue Sky Sessions for brainstorming sessions. And so he said, you call yourself the Blue Sky Rangers? We go, no, we don't call ourselves the Blue Sky Rangers. If I want to put in the article, you call yourself the Blue Sky Rangers. He said, no, well, we don't call ourselves the Blue Sky Rangers. That's a stupid name, we don't want it to say. And so finally he said, how about we say, you are the Blue Sky Rangers? Because if I say you're the Blue Sky Rangers, then you're the Blue Sky Rangers. And our vice president said, nah. And the senior vice president in charge of publicity said, yes, we want this article. So the article said that we are the Blue Sky Rangers, which we thought was a very stupid name, which is why we immediately made up T-shirts and all sorts of signs, because anytime something is stupid, we embrace it. And that's how we became the Blue Sky Rangers.
I'm Don Daglow. I was director of Intellivision game development after the group got big enough that we split all the other machines away from Intellivision. And Mike Minkoff and I were pretty much partners in crime all the way through the process as Mattel grew. I was one of the 5 on the first formalized day of Intellivision game development. Utopia is the one cartridge I wrote myself before I got up into management and stopped coding.
Hi, I'm Dave Warhol, application software engineer at Mattel Electronics. Hired on, I don't know, the group was probably about 30 people or something like that when I hired on. I was hired by Don here. He posted the job. Don went to Pomona College where I was working at the time and sent the notification for, hey, we're looking for programmers. And because I was working there, I just said, I'm not going to post that for the students, and responded.
I think I actually interviewed with Keith, and I remember asking him if it was as fun to work in this place as it looked. And I didn't know. I think maybe that was it, huh?
Well, to quickly throw in, that was one of the things is, and I think that Dave, you've said this about when you hire people, what's the first qualification? They have to really want to do the job. The enthusiasm for the games. It's not, it's not the programming there, but it's really the enthusiasm. And yeah, I walked in. You're going to meet this guy, Joe, and I walked in there, and the first thing, is it as much fun to work here as I think it is? And I mean that type of enthusiasm. That's what we're looking for.
And it was. I think everybody, good man or woman agrees.
Hi, Michael Minkoff. I started in Mattel in the toy company for about 10 years before I transferred into electronics in 1979, doing handheld games. At that time, as Keith mentioned, APH was doing all the Intellivision programming. And myself and Rick Levine, who was a programmer working for me, who was did the handheld bowling game. We were selected as the first 2 Mattel employees to learn Intellivision programming and bring the technology back in-house.
So I went to UCLA, I saw an ad in the paper, or ad posting actually at UCLA Job Center for jobs at Mattel, and I said, well, I'll interview at a variety of places. Aerospace was big then. I interviewed at Hughes, TRW, and Mattel, and I got 2 offers, one from Hughes, one from Mattel. And I said, well, I could always get a real job. I'll go to Mattel. And that's all I've been doing ever since. I was when these guys told me, and I didn't even know this, I was the 6th employee of the Intellivision group, the first one actually hired outside at that point, and they had to wait for me for several months because I hadn't graduated yet. So they gave me a copy of Your Friend the Exec, and I walked out these days, with the way confidentiality works, I'd never have gotten to see it until I walked in the building and signed in blood, and I wouldn't have been able to take the book out of the building. But back then, it was this little, mimeographed thing with a number on it. And they said, sure, take a copy, read it. And so I read all about the Exec and learned how to program the thing. And, I was ready to go my first day of work. It was a lot of fun. I did Space Off.
Hi, I'm Keith Robinson. I started at Mattel. The reason for it was I've been working in special effects in television and in film. I'd been doing some consulting for Universal Studios on Masada, History of the World Part 1, and I worked on the world-famous Star Wars Holiday Special. I don't know if you're familiar with this. It's an infamous thing. I was actually there doing the special effects for that, which no one had heard of for years, and now it's like on the website and it's this infamous thing. And so if you don't know about it, check it out on the website. But I had gone over to Information International and to talk to them about the movie Tron, which they were working on, and was talking to them, and we got sitting around talking about video games, because the movie's about games, and I wonder how they program these games. We're all just sitting there, none of us knew how they program games. And the next day, I heard that voice from God driving along on the radio saying, "Come to Mattel." And I went over there mainly because curiosity. We've just been talking about how do they program games. I'll go over and check and see how they do program games. And when I walked in, the very nicely dressed English gentleman walked up to me and said, I see, because we had these badges that said we were programmers marketing, whatever. I said, does he have the badge that you're a programmer? Are you available for all types of programming, or are you just here because of the games? And I said, just because of games. He goes, that's very good, very good. Come over here and talk to me. This was Gabriel Baum, who was ultimately the VP of Intellivision software development, and he rejected anybody who said they were available for all type of programming. It was like set the standard that we're only interested in people who want to do games.
I was working at a Hughes Aircraft Company, had been there for about 6 years, and I knew about the Intellivision. I drove by Mattel one day, it was on the same street as where I worked at Hughes, and saw that they had job openings. And so I looked in the paper and found their ad, and it said 1 to 3 years of microprocessor experience. And I see I have 6 years on mini computers, mostly in Fortran. Oh, that's a good match. So I took my resume and crossed out the top secret clearance. Wrote down that I had 100 board games and sent it in. And it turned out that the microprocessor that they have looked an awful lot like the PDP-11 I was working on at Hughes, and not really like a 6502 or a Z80, which is what their ad was going to get them. So I did very well when they gave me, part of the interview process was they gave you this little snippet of code and asked you to tell them what it is, and it looked just like PDP-11 code, and so I told them right away what it was, and Mike was duly impressed.
I'm Karen Nugent, and I did graphics. I started, first time at Mattel, I believe it was in 78 or 77, and we would do the graphics for, we did Dr. Art Eileen and Jack LaLanne, and we sent it to APH, and it'd take about a day, I think, to get it back. Is that about right? At least overnight. And then we decided if we liked it. If we didn't like it, we had to send it back again. So we'd do it on the graphic paper again. Then I came back after a year, and we had something a lot better. We had a great big pixel keypad, and every little pixel was on with just like a key. And we got rid of that with a sledgehammer finally. And I worked on Burger Time and Mission X, a few others.
I'm Dave Akers, and I worked in M Network on 2600 games, and I got. That's why we make you sit behind the television. That's why I have to hire that. Second class hotels that I can do. And I bought a home computer, and I spent most of my time on that, playing video games and trying to write my own video games. And so, when Mattel Electronics had a job fair, I went there. And I talked to Don and Mike, and I got to meet all these game programmers, and I gave them all copies of my resume, and I thought it went really well. Then a week later, I got a rejection letter saying, you know, thanks for coming, but some really talented people came in, we had to hire them instead. And then, like that. And then a week later, I got a call from Mattel personnel, and they said, could you send us a copy of your resume? And in one part of my mind, I knew, well, you know, they already have a copy of my resume, but I figured, hey, this is games. And so I sent them the resume, and I got the interview, and I interviewed with Mike Mikoff and Gabriel, and I got the job.
I mean, some of the solutions that when there was no hardware development stations, rail sharing, and there was no graphics development stations, this big board of pixel buttons that Karen was talking about, some of the programmers themselves innovated software solutions so that they actually wrote games to make graphics. There's a program called Mr. Color where it used a hand controller to turn on and off pixels right there on the Intellivision, and that immediately elevated the productivity of the art department. And then another guy, Rick Koenig, wrote a software debugger which allowed you to set breakpoints and single-step your games with, it would actually disassemble on the screen on top of your game. So there were some really creative technical solutions to get around the limitations of no development stations and no art development stations.
Although we have to say the Mr. Color tool, which was so important in graphics development, really helped. What we had to do, because we couldn't get money approved for stopping to build tools, what Gabriel and I did was, if we just listed it as Mr. Color, which sounded like a neat title. And so Gabriel, in the executive meetings, would explain it as, oh yes, it's a prospective game we're working on. We don't intend to work on it for very long. We'll Fisher cut bait very quickly. And by the time we got to the point where it had been around long enough for them to ask questions, the tool was done and we didn't have to explain it.
Back there. Did you feel any more creative through iMagic or Atari?
That's an easy one to answer, because the reason I left Atari was because I was feeling stifled. When I joined Atari, it was 30 people. When I left Atari, it was how many thousands? 4,000. 4,000. I was feeling very, very constrained and very, very kind of burdened by the immense amount of people and the big structure of the company. I'm not sure it was $1 billion company at that point, but it was certainly pretty big. And as a matter of fact, the way my thought patterns worked were, I thought that I could convince Atari to start a small little group in another location like Santa Cruz or something, where I would fund a small group because I had a good relationship with them and I thought they would do that. And I remember that I knew all about the engineering and I knew all about all the technical things, but I knew nothing about the marketing and the business. So I called up Bill Grubb, who knew about business and marketing, and was getting his advice on how to approach Atari. And about halfway through the conversation, about an hour into the conversation, Bill said, "Well, Dennis, why are you doing this to Atari? Why don't you just go out and start a company?" Whoa, revelation, and it literally never occurred to me, And so that's kind of how that all went, really.
And Bill Grubb was our CEO.
Yeah, Bill Grubb was our CEO.
I thought a lot about that, actually. We were more creative. At Atari, we had coin-op conversions. And again, at the beginning of my career, I was with my game, the Night Driver, I copied Missile Command. I did another game, Space Invaders on the Atari 800, and then I did another game that never saw the light of day. I barely remember it, and it was my first shot at an original game. Well, guess what? It's hard to do an original game on the VCS. When you have 128 bytes of RAM and 4K of ROM, and you don't have a lot of palette. Your palette's not good. So copying something is not a stupid idea. So at Magic, it was more creative that we didn't have a license. We didn't have licenses to copy. We had to come up with our own themes. But again, the best stuff we did was that was pretty directly like an arcade game. And the stuff in my own personal work, when I started to kind of explore my creative side, like with Fathom and with Cubicolor, that stuff's kind of out there. And to me, I look at it now, play it now, it's like, what was I was trying to make stuff up, and I wasn't trying to do what I did well, which is really take a good arcade play pattern and put it onto the. But we did have more creative freedom at Magic simply because we didn't have a license to go take a video game and copy it directly. We had to make up our own.
We hit one of the high points. We're all answering some more questions. I wanted to talk about the briefcase. We were paying royalties, but we decided that all the support people just plain weren't being compensated well enough. So three of us got together and decided that we would take a portion of our royalties and split it among everybody. So one of the artists who had really been just a gem by the name of Michael Becker, he's over at Electronic Arts these days, had really gone the extra mile for all of us, had done some great art for us. So we went out, bought a briefcase, and filled it full of $5,000 of 5s and 1s, and gave it to him. Of course, this was before crack, so he didn't have problems at the bank. But they kind of looked at him a little strange. But that was one of the better memories I have. Yeah.
Yes?
Who came up with the name iMagic, or were there other names that were around?
You know, actually, that name came pretty easily, and I remember that, and I tell you, I've thought of 1,000 names since, and I can tell you it's virtually impossible to come up with a decent name for a company these days. And I look back at that. It was so simple to come up with that name, and to this day, I thought, well, yeah, that's a name. That name's catchy. You know, it's easy to remember. It's got all the right, you know, things in it. And to this day, it's like, try to think of a name. It's like, oh, let's see, advanced computing, you know, something like that. You know, it's not easy to think of a name for a company. So again, it was just fortuitous timing and circumstance, I think, more than anything.
Came out of a brainstorming session.
Yeah, we were great. Anything else? Yeah.
Any plans to update the original iMagic games for the new consoles or the PC?
That's a hot one. Well, the three of us own no rights whatsoever to any of our games, so certainly if it's done, we won't be doing it.
Who owns the rights?
I actually delivered all of our source listings and all of our diskettes to Activision just about the time that our company owned it. So at that time, they were the owners. I have no idea who owns them now. Are they? Okay.
Yeah, whenever something like that happens, it's a lot of news. So we tried to do this game in the Retro FX here. Oh, they've got an emulator out there that actually took Ghosts and Goblins. God, they've taken the same thing. They had today's technology inventing those games. It's about the same thing. But they gave
Many call a hardware guru or genius, responsible for the hardware of the 800 computer and the 2600 game system, as well as some work on the Amiga, right? So let me introduce to you Joe Decuir.
Good morning. Let me first quote the person who I wish was here but who died 5 years ago, Jay Miner. He was my mentor, my guru. I was apprenticed to him first in the spring of 1976, and one of the first things he told me was that success has 1,000 fathers and failure is an orphan. In 1976, there were no good self-development tools for a 6502 system. There were no personal computers based on the 6502, other than a little tiny thing called the TIM, which they used at Grass Valley, and another little flat thing with a keyboard and an LCD on it called the KIM, which is what I bought and used to hot rod to do, you know, as a sort of a machine monitor and a loader and whatnot. But there was nothing to do self-assembly, so I had to get a time-sharing account, and I used as a they gave me this lecture about passwords. No, you can't use your mother's maiden name. Nothing anybody could guess. So I was bicycling to work, and I had a Stella brand bicycle, so I used that. So Jay looked at that name and said, "That's a cool name. We should name the chip that." Okay, so it became the Stella chip. And then his boss, Bob Brown, said, "That's a cool name. We should name the product that." So he did. So we had to rename the chip TIA. And then marketing at Atari, those people who passed for marketing said, "Oh, they're naming products after women." And they proceeded to put in every other product after women. And then Apple got the same disease, and so we had the Lisa product becoming the actual, you know, well, you got the idea. That's where the habit came from. I still own the bicycle. Gloss through this one. Culling system was used in the 400 and 800, in the 5200, which was a different use of the same chips, the 65XE, and etc. So you guys know what I'm talking about. Okay, the requirements were split. This was our second system, if you know what Brooks Law means. We had to support 1979 vintage arcade games. We knew we would need to leapfrog the 2600 before somebody else did. We thought if we were wildly successful and it was clear that was happening, then we were going to attract a lot of competition. We had to be better. We knew that. But we also wanted to do a home computer. Uh-oh. And bitmap graphics, and we thought we could do, you know, home computers were being used to run games.
and it was possible to us that game machines could be home computers also. This is still being played out. Sony's going to try to sell the PlayStation 2 as a home computer. I think it's going to be quite amusing, actually. Support home computer. So we saw the Apple II, the Commodore VIC-20, and Radio Shack appliance machines coming. The result was we designed 2 machines in parallel with essentially the same design and different packaging. We intended the Atari 800 to be packaged and sold as a full computer, and the Atari 400 as a game machine with a flat keyboard so that it had rudimentary compatibility. You know, like you can design Star Raiders to use keys, but we didn't expect you to do data entry with a 400. We expected that to be a game machine that could also be a computer. We expected the 800 was a computer that could also be a game machine. Got it? Right.
No, actually it runs till 6 tonight. Tomorrow.
The gentleman to our left put celebrity status into video games, not only because they made great games, but they promoted themselves and the programmers at the company they worked for and started. Michael Crichton, you know, all the other book writers, sports figures have their names on their work. Yet, up until the early 80s, many of the designers and programmers received no credit for their work. Without further ado, to my left is, I'm sorry, David Roll. He was one of the original Activision people. He did a lot of the M Network and Intellivision titles. Steve Cartwright, he was one of the originals. He currently works at Electronic Arts. Gary Kitchen and David Crane, they currently do Java-based games on the internet at skyworkstech.com, and I encourage you to check it out. It's a lot of fun. It's simple, like a lot of the original 2600 games they worked on. Without further ado, please give a warm welcome to the Activision program.
And I was in the post-PRGE depression once on a trip to Chicago to McCormick Place, which is where the CES was being held, trying to think about what was the next game I was going to do. And as luck would have it, I look, you know, you're riding this bus, you know, the tour bus that takes from the hotels to the convention. You're riding this bus. I look out, and here's some idiot trying to cross 8 lanes of Lakeshore Drive. And if anybody knows, I mean, just absolutely insane. And I said, well, that looks like a good idea for a video game, and I did Freeway. And Freeway was a little man running across all these multiple lanes of traffic.
Yeah, it wasn't called Freeway either.
It wasn't called Freeway, no. And it got to within 2 weeks of production. And Jim Levy, our president, came to us and said, you know, it's a great game and all, but if you made it a chicken, you know, crossing the road, and we could say, oh, why did the chicken cross the road and such, we could hire the San Diego chicken at the trade show coming. So that was the impetus for making it a chicken and making it one of the whole story of why the chicken crossed the road and such. However, I had a version that we didn't show at the trade show, where the little man actually got squashed into a pool of blood whenever he got run over by a car. And we called that one Splat, yes. So we could have released that as well, but I think we did better with chicken.
You have to understand, I was looking at Activision differently than Steve and Dave, because I was on the East Coast. We had our own little office, we had our own design group, and they were 3,000 miles away. So a lot of what went on day to day, we didn't really know that much about. They would come out, you know, we'd talk to them or we'd go out there. But we really had a different view of the world looking at it from the East Coast. And I just have to tell you what our view was when we started with Activision. You had these 4 guys, which actually turned into 5 with Steve, because Steve started before we did. So Steve was already there. So you had these 5 guys, and I went out and I visited their offices, and there was a locked door, and the locked door was the lab. No one could go in. And the employees were all scared to death of the designers. I mean, the hierarchy that had been built up here was you don't talk to them, you don't bother them, they come and go as they please, you never, never go through that locked door. This is a place that's out of bounds for everybody. So, in our office, I mean, here we, young guys, we've joined this big company, we idolize these guys, and now we work with them, and every piece of work that we had to do had to go through, ultimately through them. So we'd build a game, we'd love it, we'd get it all ready to go, and then it had to go to the big heads. And that's what they were called in our office. My good friends here called them the big heads. Well, now the games, and this became a normal thing. Well, all right, games none's got to go to the big heads. And then they get to see it, and they'd abuse the hell out of it. Abuse was a good word to use. Abuse the hell out of it, would come bouncing back to us, and we'd have to make changes. So there's a couple of stories about the big heads. One is we do...
I got to defend it.
Okay, go ahead.
The reason we did that was we had developed what was really a very successful method of doing video games. It was 4 of us and then 5 of us in a lab, and we worked in one room. We were basically, you could turn toward your cubicle and you could work on your own computer, but you were not isolated from anyone else. And if anybody walking by your screen says, that looks like crap, you'd have to take it. I mean, we would all like the game before we would release the game. Everybody had to like it. And so
A couple of things. We went out to interview with Activision after I had called them and said, hey, we do 2600, and thought we were crazy. I went out to interview with in California, brought my brother Dan Kitchen, who did a few 2600 cartridges. And the most hilarious thing about the interview process, it really had nothing to do with coding or game design or anything. We sat in a room, Alan Miller came in with a 2600, and Alan Miller had done Ice Hockey, which was one of the all-time great cartridges. And my brother Dan took the controller, beat the shit out of him at Ice Hockey. And Alan Miller said, God damn, you guys are good. And then Dan picked up Barnstorming and did a world record score on that. And that was it. We were hired. I mean, that's all we needed to do.
One story I tell is that I tell people, do you realize I used to get 10,000 fan letters a week? I say, wow, that's impressive. I said, well, then again, they were all from 14-year-old boys. So it wasn't exactly the ideal situation. But there were a lot of fun times back then.
In programming, as I understand it, and maybe because I'm the youngest, where actually programming was an art in itself rather than the thing that the hardware people ripped it into. So I don't know, anyway. But I'm the one, the technical stories come to my mind, and they're probably not very interesting, but I'll try, and especially since I wasn't with you for the best of these periods. But when I was still at Mattel, and we were starting to drift and say, hey, look at those Activision people. They're doing good work and they're making money in the 2600. We've got the Intellivision. Yeah, it's great, but there's 10 million 2600s in the world and several million Intellivisions. And so we got into M Network, which was the Mattel attempt to distribute Atari 2600 units. And so we reverse engineered the 2600 unit, and we did that using Kaboom. Basically, we needed a program to see how it worked, and we took that was your game, wasn't it?
No, that was actually Larry Kaplan. Larry
Kaplan. Okay. Anyway, it's kind of interesting. It was a 2K game, and this is a game where the man at the top, you could move. Let's see, he moves back and forth, dropping bombs, and you've got a little bucket of water, and you've got to catch it at the bottom. And it was a 2K game, and the program was one long line of code. I mean, as a programmer, I expect subroutines, okay? You don't know what a subroutine is? A subroutine is very inefficient because you have a go-to and you have a return, and so that costs 2 bytes. And they didn't have...
Well, it also costs stack. You didn't have any of that either.
Yeah, okay, so basically you required resources to have a sub... I mean, yeah, it organized your program so you could read it, but, who cares, especially, I don't know, I guess if your background is in hardware, and the nuances of structured programming, and the fact, anyway, I didn't know whether to vomit or to go and worship the author of this, this game, because it was absolutely brilliant. It was 2K.
All right, a couple of quick turning points. When did we know? This is the answer to when we knew it was all going away. Quick one, I walked into Toys R Us, and right in the front was a big display, and it had Parker Brothers Star Wars 2600 cartridges, 2 of them, Empire Strikes Back, Return of the Jedi. $1.99, get a $2 rebate. Just make a penny on every one you bought. It was a business in and of itself. We had We used to have Tom Lopez come out every 3 months and show us the new work from the West Coast. I mean, he would work for the damn company, we didn't even know what they were working on. So he'd come out, and we loved it. He'd go in our conference room, say, I want to show you the next thing Steve's working on, or Dave's working on, or whatever. And we just salivated because we were so excited. And he brought out Chopper Command, and we all went crazy, thought it was the greatest thing we ever seen, and Barnstorm, Wild, you know, all these games. And I just remember this turning point. It's right in my mind. He came out one time, he said, I want to show you the 2 latest games. And he plugs me in, and one of them was River Raid, which was fine, it was a great game. Then he puts this other one in, and it wasn't done by any of these guys. It was done by someone else. And he's telling me how great it is, and we're all excited, and he walked out of the room, and I just kind of looked around and said, wait a minute, that game sucks. This is Activision, what's going on here? And he had convinced himself that this was another one in the line of great cartridges, but it wasn't done by Dave or Al or Bob or Steve, and it wasn't done in our office, and it was like the beginning of the end. We had to go beyond the skill level to get to a certain point to find it.
It wasn't done by Dave either.
It wasn't done by Dave over there either. It was done by someone else. I won't even tell you what the game was, but it just really was glaring to me that we're going to put our name on that game. I wouldn't do it because I don't want to insult anybody. And even that same meeting, actually no, it was the next meeting. A few months later, when these 30 people all dumped their product and the whole business went to hell in a handbasket, Activision decided people don't want games anymore, we're going to do something else. So they came out to our design office and sat down for a big meeting and said, you got to think differently, video games are old, they're passé, games are gone, you know, do creative stuff, do this, productivity software. I mean, this is a really bad example of a company trying to reinvent itself when it wasn't their fault that the business had crashed.
What was it that made some of those games fun? And why is it that nowadays some games that are put out and actually do very well maybe don't have that same level of fun? And Dave touched on it a little bit when he talked about the hardware capability of the VCS. It could do 2 objects on the screen. Luckily, the hardware designers that built in the capability allowed us to have multiple copies of those 2 objects. So on any one line of the screen, you could have 3 copies of 2 objects, or 6 objects. You could do something else. You could actually repeat those and have multiple rows of 3 copies of 2 objects. In essence, you could create an endless wave of objects coming down the screen. But what was it about that made the games fun? Well, if you have an endless wave of things, what you do is you start creating patterns in the gameplay and the way the objects move. The patterns allowed us to try to make the game player adapt to those patterns. And when the game player could adapt his play to those patterns, he would do that by falling into a groove. Or, you think, what's fun about that? Well, you surf, the idea of falling into the groove, surfing, catching a wave. If you ski, going back and forth down a slope. If you play golf, doing that perfect 9-iron, where you feel like you can't do anything wrong. Athletes call it the zone. And that's what we did with the games back then. We tuned them so precisely that we have the game player actually fall into a zone playing it to try to match the patterns on the screen. Of course, every once in a while, we'd disrupt that pattern. Like the Mad Bomber would be moving back and forth across the top of the screen. All of a sudden, there would be a little hitch in his movement, and you'd have to recover from that. Or objects would be moving across the screen, they'd drop a missile occasionally. And that would jolt you back to reality. Well, what happened? Why is it that stopped? I mean, those games were fun. When the Commodore C64 came out, it had 8 objects, not 2. I think, gee, that should be better, right? Well, the problem was you couldn't repeat those 8 objects. You couldn't make multiple copies of those 8 objects. You had 8 objects, period. So what we did, we said, well, why don't we take all 8 objects and combine them into one big object? It looks cool. We'd have this giant spaceship that fills a quarter of the screen. That's cool, isn't it? That's neat. If you're shooting at one big object in the middle of the screen, well, that's not very fun. Suppose we move it around erratically, make it hard to hit. Well, that's kind of like swatting a fly. So, and swatting a fly isn't fun. So games went from patterns of objects that made you fall into a groove to play the game. All of a sudden, we're trying to swat a fly. And nowadays, unfortunately, a lot of the games are the same way. You have a big fly on the screen you're trying to swat. The only difference is nowadays, that Fly is made of 7,000 polygons, and it takes a 3D hardware accelerated machine to show it. And you have to have a P3-400 with 128 megabytes of RAM and an 8 gig hard drive and a DVD player and digital Dolby surround sound. But it's still a big Fly that you're trying to swat.
And currently an executive producer, right, at Disney. So here we'll give you Sam, and he can tell you more about his work.
I'd like to thank all three of you for sharing everything. Let's see. I'm one of those people in the business that you've never heard of, and that's because only in the last couple of years have I actually been standing in front of a microphone and talking. In fact, some of you might know me by my secret code name, which is Yoshiro Kamimoto. And I'll explain where that comes from in a minute. On November 3rd of this year will mark the 20th year I've been in the interactive industry. And that is the release of my first game for the Apple II, which I self-published. So I've been at this for a very long time. But to cover 20 years in 30 minutes means I get about a minute and a half per year, so I'm going to try to move as fast as I can. The lessons that can be learned from Star Trek was that this was a coin-op game, and it was ran on a Z80, and the total memory on the game was 48K, which I'm always happy when I can find a graphic on the internet that's that small. But this is the entire game, including all the speech, all the sound effects, all the graphics, everything. And it was actually an innovative game in a way because it was one of the first games with 3D vector graphics, which, by the way, was all pre-calculated and stored in the ROMs. We didn't actually calculate any of that in real time. The processor just wasn't fast enough. But the design was much larger than the game actually ended up being built. So one of the big lessons I learned there was taking big ideas and shrinking them down. I don't know how many people are familiar with the game, but the bottom was like outside of the, through the window view was like the viewer. And then in the upper right-hand corner, I think it was, there was kind of a map view. And in the left-hand corner was a status display. And originally, all three of those were dynamic full screens that the computer would switch. And I did have it running that way, but it was great because you'd be seeing it from a map view, right? And then as you got close to a Klingon, they would dynamically switch screens so you'd have them in your sights from the window view. And I just thought it was the coolest thing, but required more memory than the system could handle, so we had to compromise. So, and ever since then, I've built games big and then shrunk them down, and I think they benefit from that process. Probably most exciting game in those days at Sega was a game called 4-Player Eliminator. And I know this game was released. The more popular version was the 2-player game. It was a vector graphics game, and for those of you who might not remember it, there was a huge asteroid in the center that had a tube, and there was a monster ship inside. And what was kind of innovative is when you shot your friend, it didn't blow them up, you shoved them. And the object was to shove them into the meteor, because contact with meteor was the only thing that could hurt you. Well, anyway, way before Quake or Doom or any of these games, we had this 4-player game that just kicked ass. It became completely addictive because you and 4 of your buddies would get together and try to shove each other into the asteroid. And if you didn't, by the way, make this tube shot, which I think, did it predate Star Wars? I don't know. Anyway, you had to make this tube shot to destroy the thing in the center. If you didn't, this eliminator would come out and basically shoot the place up. It was an incredible thing. People would play every legal break and all lunchtime, and then that late break in the afternoon, and then in the evenings. And it got to the point where people would say, "Oh, is it time for 4-player eliminator?" And we had this code. We'd go like this to each other because that was the symbol, so we could do it without people understand it. You know. And what would happen is you'd say, "Well, you know, we can't technically take a break until 10:15." And then somebody say, "Well, it's 10:15 according to my watch." Well, of course, their watch was slower fast. It was actually like 10:05. So we'd rush over there and start playing, and we'd have eliminations, because only 4 people could play, so whoever lost dropped out and somebody else could get in. And we're talking about screaming and throwing things, and hollering. It was just incredible fun. And then, of course, somebody say, "Well, it's what does it give 15-minute break? It's 10:30." And well, not according to my watch. You know, my watch says it's 10:05. So we'd actually get about 45 minutes of play for every 15-minute break, and of course, same thing happened at lunch. And eventually, management realized that this was affecting productivity. So, in probably the most stupid move ever in video game management history, they decided to start sabotaging the game. So they'd come in and pull a board and cut wires on it and put it back in. So we'd fire it up, and you know, there'd be a spark, or there'd be nonsense graphics on the screen or whatever. And I mean, these are the people who built the damn thing. So in 2 minutes, we'd have the thing soldered back together, and we actually started keeping a stack of spare cards. You know, so we could just drop them in there, because one card or another would be sabotaged every day. And then, of course, we're all programmers at the time. So somebody gets the genius idea to have it so that you can enter a secret code into the left, right, thrust, and fire buttons, and program the game to give themselves an advantage. Okay. So what they do is somebody would sneak a new program and rig it so that the eliminator would shoot at somebody that they specified, and not them, when he came out. And I remember the first time I realized that was happening, and then we had this kind of contest to see who could introduce these bugs without anybody else, these kind of mods without anybody else being able to notify it. But notice it. But I'll tell you, I really learned about the power of multiplayer gaming, and it's about going head-to-head with somebody who you kind of know, and somebody you wouldn't mind beating. And I think that's really what Quake is all about, isn't it? I mean, nobody ever plays the levels, do they? You know, it's you and your buddies killing each other, and it's a lot of fun. Anyway, after doing that for a while, I went off to work at the Walt Disney Company, and started there in 1988. And I worked on some titles some of you might be familiar with. Anyone remember the Disney Animation Studio, Arachnophobia, Dick Tracy, or for those of you in educational software, Mickey's 1-2-3s, Mickey's ABCs, Mickey's Colors and Shapes. Did some cartridge games too, Mickey's Ultimate Challenge. God, I think I did 16 games in 6 years I was at Disney at the beginning. And some of the kind of notable stories here was, for those of you who remember the Disney Animation Studio, that was the #1 selling productivity product for a couple of years there. And in fact, to this day, it's still used by people. It's to my knowledge, the only comprehensive effort anyone has ever made to actually teach animation. The program was spectacular. And the manual was extremely comprehensive because it actually walked you through. What I did is I went to the feature animation at Disney and I said, what are the secrets to animation? And they told me. And so what I did is I put it together into this book. So even if you never ran the software, you get this tremendous education in animation. The way the animation studio started is it was actually a developer tool, which I had observed at a developer called Silent Software. And there's the rather famous Reichert, Baron Reichert, Kurt von Wurschild, who ran that group. And I basically talked him into taking this internal tool and turning it into a commercial product. So the programming of this thing was almost trivial. It was really just taking a tool out onto the market, and that wasn't the only one. I don't know how many people here remember Deluxe Paint, but Deluxe Paint was, I believe it was Electronic Arts, was it? An Electronic Arts internal tool that eventually became a commercial product. And I'm not embarrassed to say that it's still my drawing package of choice on my PC. Oh, I was going to tell you the reason why you might want to think of me as Yoshiro Kamimoto. People were talking about, the last speakers were talking about how they never got credit. I had just done the Star Trek game, and I was very, very proud of it. And the Sega actually released to the press that the game had been developed by a gentleman by the name of Yoshiro Kamimoto in a secret laboratory in Japan. And so I went to them and I said, that was my game, right? We were talking about the Star Trek game. They go, oh yeah, but the Japanese have such cachet, we decided to, say it was made in Japan by a Japanese guy. And so from that point on, we gave each other secret Japanese code names. And so now you know mine. So anytime you see a game from Yoshiro Kamimoto.
This is a classic and contemporary video game issues. 3 people on my right: Bill Kunkel, Joyce Worley, Arnie Katz, responsible for the first video game publishing endeavors and projects. On my left, you have Christian Svensson, currently with MCV, Donald A. Thomas with VM Labs, and at the end, Mr. Ernie Cormier is currently with Grolier. And let me turn it over. Okay, let me turn it over to Van Burnham, our astute moderator.
And that is the issue of sex and violence in video games. And since we have a mix of both developers and media, I'd like to get this response from both sides, and that is, do you think that the industry has either the capacity or the motivation to self-regulate? And Don, would you like to pick up on this first?
I don't know if I'm the best person to start with on this. I mean, my opinion is that I think that the industry should, because if they don't, the government will. And I think that they're making enough money that they should at least put some research in to find out what their games are doing to affect people when they're playing them. I also think the public should get what they want. And if there's games that have violence and sex in them, and they're of legal age to acquire them, they should have the right to play them and do that. But I think that the industry then at the same time holds a responsibility to realize that what they publish has an effect on their audience, and that they should take some time to figure out what kind of effect and what they need to do to make sure that effect is not destructive.
Let me give you a real good example of this. I remember when Mortal Kombat first hit, and for the first time I think people saw actual realistic looking human beings on a screen having, spinectomies performed on and such. And it was total culture shock. I mean, it was like, they were used to it happening with stick figures maybe, but that was on a kind of abstract level. Here were real looking human beings tearing one another's internal organs out. And Nintendo sat on its high horse and said, shame, Sega. Shame on you. You publish these evil games. We publish good games. Okay, Sega got Mortal Kombat out, sold about 6 trillion copies of it. The next year, I go to the trade show, Nintendo's hired the Butthole Surfers, and they're sitting there saying, never again, there will never again be a Mortal Kombat incident. We promise you, you will get everything you want. And I watch commercials today, and I see Huggy Bear come up to the window of a car, say, "I'm looking for a wheelman," and you know, driver, you're getting away from a crime scene. The industry has no inclination to regulate itself. It's like movies.
Before we could agree on regulation, first we'd have to agree that it's necessary. I, for one, am not absolutely certain that such regulation should be forced on the industry. But in actual fact, the industry has always regulated itself by the old-fashioned method of good taste. Way back in 1982, the industry squeezed out Swedish erotica games.
Custer's Revenge.
Custer's Revenge.
Where's Stuart Kesten when we need him?
Yeah, we need him. With raindrops keep blowing on your head, playing in the background.
These were fine examples. And good taste kept them from being popular. I think good taste is enough even now. We have a violent society. We enjoy violent entertainments. Why shouldn't we have it?
Joyce, as I recall that history, those sold quite well, or at least they were on the way of selling well, so good taste wasn't involved. It was special interest groups that shut them down.
They sold less than 1/10 of what any other video game sold. The only one of those games that sold even badly, which was Custer's Revenge, which sold approximately 75,000 copies, which is pretty small potatoes for a video game.
Yeah, I don't know how long they were on the shelves before the government told them to take it off.
They never told them. The reason Custer's Revenge sold copies was that the National Organization of Women picketed it and got it a level of publicity on TV that no other video game up to that point had ever enjoyed, and they still could only sell 75,000 copies. My feeling is, as little as I like it, I recognize that in an era in which parents are mostly derelict in the upbringing of their children, that it's popularly believed that the government should step in and sort of run it for them. And I can understand why they want a rating system, and although I personally don't like the idea, I can accept that. But when it comes to what's being published, I think the people that have criticized video games are in general know-nothings. In general, that they have very little actual knowledge about video games and almost no perspective on the field. That people like Senator Lieberman speak from cowering ignorance of not only video games, but popular culture. And I must say that when I watched those Senate hearings a year or so ago, my feeling was, isn't it terrible that our country is in the hands of people who are so divorced from popular culture that it is alien to them. They have no idea about what people watch in movies, what people play in games, what people read in comic books, what people do in popular culture. Anyone who's familiar with the current movie scene and so forth would certainly say that there's nothing that can be done in a video game that hasn't been in some way echoed in splatter movies. I think that there's a lot of cheap headline hunting. It's a very safe issue because the constituency that's pro-video games is mostly relatively young. That politicians are much more concerned with creating fear among parents who might vote for them than in protecting children who don't have the vote. And I think this has been one of the most cynical and shocking crusades that I've seen in the last 10 years.
And I largely agree with you in the fact that there's no question that the people who are legislating right now have no concept of what a video game is. Most of them have played one. The problem is, the industry is now faced with the reality that if we don't regulate ourselves, then the government will step in and do it for us, which I think everyone in the industry agrees is not right. Because then you're going to see the money that would have been earmarked for maybe other products being earmarked for legal defenses and lobbying issues that we'd really rather not sink our money into. So one of the big pushes we've been doing lately with our magazine is we need to up the awareness of the rating system for parents. That is, right now, as it stands, our best defense against the government standing in. hopefully have publishers, again, as Joyce pointed out, exercise common sense and good taste.
Well, a good rating system helps sell product too. I know my son has a habit of picking up the ones, the CDs that say parental advisory on it. So you're guaranteed quality. Right.
In fact, though, there are games sold today that are actually much better done in terms of production values and arguably in gameplay, but in terms of being over the top and sex and violence, aren't far removed from that. Those three games, and I remember them well, and I remember getting in the lab and us all looking at them and thinking they were really over the top. But those kinds of games live today. And as far as the how is it going to stop? I don't believe government regulation will help. I think the ratings are, in fact, their best chance of getting a good hit. You walk into any software store and you'll see the average teenager walking up and looking for the labels and putting down, the KA and picking up the M and saying, there you go, that's my game right there. I think the way it's going to happen is within the industry. I think a lot of people that I know are getting disgusted with what's happening, are being revolted at E3 and walking away feeling like they don't really want to be part of this anymore. And I think the consumers have to speak with their dollars. That's really the only way it will work. And some games that have gotten a lot of press that were hyped as really big games have, in fact, with really over-the-top sex and violence, have failed commercially. And that's what will speak the loudest.
Our next speaker is an inventor galore, but in our hearts, he's the inventor and father of video games. He holds hundreds of patents worldwide and has continued to tinker with new ideas in technology and gaming. He is the father of the original Odyssey by Magnavox in 1972, and without further ado, please give a warm welcome to Mr. Ralph Baer.
I think I'm going to sit down until we get to the demos. Let me see how we do this. That's better. It does help to turn the switch on. The story really starts about 1966. I'd been thinking about what to do with a television set. If you think about it, TV set is a fairly complex piece of equipment, but it's cheap. And why is it cheap? It's cheap because it's a mass-produced item. It's out there. Everybody's got it. Back in '66, there were perhaps 40 million television sets in the U.S. alone, another 100 million around the rest of the world. So the idea came to me of doing something else with a TV set other than watching Channel 3 or Channel 4 or shut the other off when there was nothing decent on. And of course, the concept of games came along. I attribute it to a meeting I had with someone in New York. I was sitting around a bus terminal on the east side of New York thinking about this, that, and the other thing. The idea of game came back. Actually, it had been there before. When we built the TV set at L'Oreal back in, it's 51, I think, 51. I suggested that maybe I'll just play games on the television set, and of course everybody said, you're nuts. And that was the end of that. So the concept came back out of the back of my mind somewhere in some crevice in '66. That was probably August of that year. September 1st, I went back to the office and I ran a large division in Nashville, New Hampshire of a company called Sanders Associates. Sanders today is a Lockheed subsidiary, Lockheed Martin subsidiary. We were pretty big then. We had 10,000 people at one time. I ran a division of about 500 engineers and technicians and support people. Pretty busy guy. But while I was sitting around this bus terminal in New York, the idea came, I figured I'd better commit it to paper. So September 1st, I wrote a 4-page paper. I have a copy of it here. Laid out the whole thing and I postulated various games. And if I can find the list, I'll read you the headings. Here's a 4-page document. In fact, if you go to my website, you can read it. My website is ralphbaer.com. RALPHBAER.com. The headings are action games, board and skill games, artistic games, instructional games, board chance games, card games, game monitoring, and sports games like car races, obstacle course races, target shooting, using the screen as a target, which in fact we did very early on. I had somebody sign this, one of the engineers signed it, and the reason why I have this document, because it, along with about 10 linear feet of additional documents, it's been in and out of court over the course of 15 years, about 100,000 times. I've read all that stuff 15,000 times, otherwise I wouldn't be able to recite it after all this happened 35 years ago. So the next thing we know is we get a phone call from Fort Wayne. Would you come to Fort Wayne and demonstrate? This is roughly January, February, March of 67, 68, 68, no, 69. 69. So Lou Edlinger, the corporate patent counsel, and I take my roadshow to Fort Wayne, Indiana. We're invited to a room full of guys that are sitting around looking glum. And we went through my demonstrations, and nobody showed any real great interest, except for the manager, Jerry Martin, who was the VP for manufacturing of television sets, and also marketing manager. He saw the future. To make a long story short, out of that meeting came an agreement, which we finally signed in '71 between Magnavox and Sanders to build a unit. When that happened, we turned all our drawings, all the schematics in the brown box over to the guys in Fort Wayne, and we made repeated trips up there to help them get started. If you looked at the original Odyssey ITL 200, first Odyssey machine, circuit element by circuit element, identical to what's in that brown box. Major difference is that somewhere in the middle of '71, in discussions, we decided those switches up front and switch the unit from game to game. They had to go. We had to have something more practical. And somebody, I don't know who, probably someone at Magnavox said, hey, why don't we use a plug-in card to make all these interconnections? And that's how it went. That was a hell of a good idea. So by May of '72, Magnavox had all the dealers from these assorted stores come to 6 or 7 places in the United States where they put on demonstrations of the first Odyssey. I got invited to the first one that took place in New York, in Central Park, in a restaurant on Bowling Green on early May '72. They showed a new television set, had a camera, a handheld camera, which was quite neat. None of which excited much enthusiasm until they showed Odyssey. Well, that took the crowd by storm, and I was sitting in the audience. You know, all I could do was not to get up and yell, hey, that's my baby. At the same time, Odyssey demonstrations were taking place all over the country, including on the West Coast, where Nolan played one, Nolan Bushnell played one on May 21st, where it was at the airport marina in Burlingame, California, thanks man. And he played the ping pong game, and then Alan Alcourt was hired. There was Pong. The programming unit, we have can you hear me back there? Yeah. A bunch of switches you can see on the front panel, and in order to be able to turn the switches to the proper position, we have little cards. This one's for ping pong, this one for volleyball, this one for handball, here is one for target shooting, hockey, chase game, golf putting, which I can't do, checker games, and some more checker games. We'll run a few of them. The first one is a ping pong game. The only thing that's missing now, we found the right switch, is color. That switch was supposed to turn the background into a green field. Hasn't worked for about 15 years, so we'll do without that. Here we go. Who wants to play with me? Go ahead. Come on.
Come on down.
Move your, it's the horizontal knob. Move your spot over to the right. Move it back and forth and up and down like so. And if you have to launch, you can launch without that. Launch. Just a second. I'll get it up there.
Tell him what he has to do.
Yeah, that's it. Walk it up and down the. Walk it up and down the. Let me show you. Let me get in there.
walk it up and down the wall like that. Walk it down. There you go. Go ahead, now you take over. Whoops. I'm trying to do that to you.
Can you hold up the gun too?
I'm sorry?
Can you hold up
Sure.
the gun too?
Super. What do you got? Super. I think I hang on the that was in there, yeah. 5200. Who cares what it's for? I've had is this for real? Because somebody threw this in there. I threw it in there. It's for real. Okay. I didn't want to rip anybody off. Take that. Tell for 26. Heads up.
Heads down. Heads all around.
Just the lighting's not there.
Programming games is a dream job. I mean, I love games. I love programming. You mix the two together and get paid for it. I mean, I couldn't ask for anything better. But one of the things that reading the book Hackers, and of course I was in Hackers, and a lot of other people that I really didn't know, hadn't met before, but reading the book, it was amazing how many similarities there were. And a lot of people like me who grew up kind of, I was on my own, and I didn't have a lot of other people that were like me around. And so you have a tendency to notice that you're different from all the people around you, and that gives you the feeling that you're unique and really, really a different kind of person. And so seeing the book Hackers and seeing that there's a whole bunch of people like that was really neat. There were several things in common, and one of the things in common that is kind of the desire to improve the world. I mean, that's what hackers like to do. We like to make things better, and it's great to see benefits of that. And so seeing people that enjoyed the games, remember the games after 15 years, ask me questions about them, I mean, that makes the whole thing worthwhile. I mean, it really does. It was neat to do the product, but to know that people enjoyed it and played it and still remember it is that's just really special. So thank you guys for that. Anyhow, you had, yeah.
Yeah, well, like the other speech, I'd like to know how you got into the gaming back in the days, program, how you got there.
Well, I really enjoyed playing games back when I went to high school. The equivalent of a computer was a little teletype machine over, it must have been like a 100 baud connection with a paper tape reader and everything, and that was basically what we had. But we played the old mainframe Star Trek game and such. And I watched somebody play this game, and it was behaving completely different than I was used to. And I went, what in the world is going on? And he says, well, I just kind of tweaked the game a little bit. I changed it. And my eyes just kind of lit up. I said, changed it? What do you mean? What can you change? And so he introduced me to literally programming in BASIC. And I went on to kind of modify some games. And then from modifying games, it went to creating kind of new versions of things I was familiar with. And then I took a programming job at an optics company, kind of a scientific company, that I only had for about a year. And it was okay. I mean, I learned assembly language programming and a few other things, but I really wanted to find out if there was a business in doing games. And there was a West Coast computer fair that Sierra Online was at, or Online Systems, they were called at the time. And they literally had a little flyer that said wanted game programmers. And so I went up to him and asked him what the story was, and he told me where he was, and I was kind of looking for getting out of San Diego anyway. So he flew me up to the mountains in Central California, and I've been living there ever since. Well, you know, the Atari 800 is my favorite machine. I mean, that will probably always be my favorite machine. My computer room right now, which is relatively small, I've got 2 Atari setups, one of which is the 65816 machine that's in the corner. Hopefully some of you got a chance to at least look at it. After this is over, if anybody has any specific questions about that, I can show some special things about that machine. It's really pretty nifty. But anyhow, I have 2 of those. I have 2 Amigas, an Amiga 1000 and an Amiga 3000. I have and a PC, and I guess that's it. Oh, and an Atari ST. And of all of those machines, I mean, I know that the Atari will be the last one that is still left in that group. I mean, even after all the machines have ceased to be useful and I replace them with something else or whatever, I'm always going to keep that machine. And part of it is the sentimental value. It's where I got started. Even though I did do a couple of things before my Atari world, I mean, the Ataris were really where I found my niche and learned how to program and learn how to do games. So what I've decided to do, I'm going to be starting Game Boy, programming color Game Boy, which is probably the closest thing to 80s programming that you can get today. It's 32K of RAM. You ask most programmers, 32K of RAM. It's like, K? What's a K? Is that bigger than a meg? My goodness, you got that much. People don't even remember what a K is. And so it's going to be neat because there aren't a lot of people doing it. That may change if the platform gets really popular, but I think there's a lot of people that don't like to program on restricted environments like that. I find it's a blast. I mean, I think it's so neat to be able to take a machine that has less than state-of-the-art capabilities and see how much you can really get out of it. Some of our early Game Boy tests, we did some demos and other things for Nintendo and for Sierra Online, and it's I've got stuff just kind of like I did back in the old Atari days. Lots and lots of interrupt-driven processes, throw tons of colors at it, throw tons of art at it, and it's coming out really good. Most of the color Game Boy products I've seen so far are fairly generic in their support of what the machine can do. So I'm looking forward to really being able to get almost back to what I did in the early 80s in terms of just the way the programming feels, the kinds of things that I can do about it, and that's really exciting. I hope that works out really well for me.
Number 1 for the movie prize. Name, win again. Well, we've got a break for the show. We're 9:54. David Frank from Rancho Cordova, California. Take this certificate over to handhold. That makes me cry. Thank you, sir. Okay, underneath this number is the winning number. This one will win your choice of a battle zone or missile command, including shipping in the U.S. if you can't get it home. 408. Michael Stanberry from Jacksonville, Florida. You win yourself your choice. Once again, thanks to everybody. Salvation Army, thank you for their